economic condition of the society and the ideologies of the society are the social ideologies that determine the economic conditions in society. If you look at the theory of Marxism, it talks about two basic things. What does it talk about? It talks about two basic things. Remember, first of all, they focus on base and secondly, the superstructure. So the concept of base and superstructure is very important in the theory of Marxism. Both of them, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they describe the society as comprising an economic background, a material base in which there is class struggle. First of all, they viewed the society as a platform for class struggle. And according to them, there are two classes of people. One is the bourgeois or the upper class or the richer class, and the proletariat, which is the lower class, the working class, the laborer class, or the have-nots. And they thought the literature belongs to the superstructure, but the superstructure of literary production is not possible unless the base or the foundation is very strong. So what do they focus? First of all, you must remember the Marxist criticism focused on two aspects. One is the base, the other is the superstructure. And they contend that the superstructure relates to literature, literary production, poetry, novel, drama, prose, story, etc. And along with that, they also argue that the superstructure is only possible when the base is strong. And what is the base? The base is the economic background. The base is their material affluence, whether they are well off in their economic condition, whether they have square meals a day, if they are paid twice, if they don't have any wants in society, all their wants are fulfilled. So all those things used to be focused in the base. And they argue that the base needs to be very strong. In this connection, they introduce the metaphor of a building. If the foundation of the building is very strong, then the superstructure of 4-story or 5-story or 10-story is strong. If the foundation is weak, then the 4-storied superstructure shall collapse like a house of cards. So they maintain that the base needs to be stronger in order to get a strong superstructure. And they strongly believed that good literary production is possible only when the base is strong, the economic condition of the people is strong, they don't have any material needs, their financial condition is very good, then they will be enthused to write, and the readers will be inspired to read. They further said, who? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They said that there are certain values and there are certain tensions which relate to the historical background. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they thought that literature is the reflection of society and the dynamics of class struggle. It is not only a mirror, but it gets the refraction and mediation to represent the reality. So, what reality is refracted? What reality is reflected? What reality is presented in literature? The class struggle. The struggle of the poorer people for their survival. The poor people, they always make a struggle in order to survive in society. Their survival becomes difficult if they are not provided with the basic needs, the existential needs. What are the basic needs? The basic needs are food, cloth, and shelter. So, food, cloth, and shelter are very important in order to make literary production possible. It is as important as the writer is or the writing is. It is as important to the writer as it is important to the reader. So the literary production can only flourish when the financial condition is good, when there is proper balance between the rich and the poor. So according to Marxists or the theorists of Marxism, like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they always argue that literary production is possible and literary production is based on the class struggle, the social difference, the financial difference that existed in the society between two classes of people, two groups of people. On the one hand, there is bourgeois or the richer section of people. On the other hand, there is the proletariat or the poorer section of people. So literature used to be the reflection of the class dynamics or the struggle of class distinction. The picture of class distinction. There are other thinkers like Louis Althusser who said that literature adopts an ideology. Literature is based on an ideology. What is an ideology? It is a set of values. It is a set of principles which a group of people they used to strongly believe. And ideology reinforces the values represented by the ruling class, or question them, making it a site of struggle between the dominant and the resistant worldviews. So, first of all, Louis Althusser, another Marxist critic, he observed that literature is the byproduct of an ideology. And whose ideology? What is ideology? Ideology is a set of principles, a set of values represented by the ruling class. And those values of the ruling class are questioned by the ruled or the poorer people who are ruled by the ruling class or the subjects. And that question, whatever question they are making, the ruled people or ruled class is making, that is also reflected in literature. So literature reflects the ideology of the ruling class and the challenge thrown by the ruled class to the ideologies of the ruling class. So literature, according to Marxists, represents largely the class struggle, and it embodies the tension of class struggle, disparity of class struggle, discrimination of class struggle. Either they legitimize the hegemony of the ruling class or they lend voice to the marginalized or the oppressed class. So in Marxist theory, the critics believe that literature embodies two types of things. Either it embodies the ideology of the ruling class, the hegemony of the ruling class, and the writers attempt to legitimize the hegemony of the ruling class, the leadership, the big brotherly attitude of the ruling class, or they deal with the suppressed voice of the marginalized people, of the people who are suppressed and oppressed by the ruling class, whose rights are taken away, whose rights are snatched away by the ruling class. So the ruling class used to enjoy all the privileges. That's why they are called the privileged class. Whereas the poorer class, they do not have such privileges. That's why they are called the unprivileged or underprivileged class. So according to Marxist critics, there are two classes of people, the privileged and unprivileged or underprivileged, the rich and the poor, the bourgeois and the proletariat, the haves and the have-nots. And along with that, they also say that this class struggle gets full representation in literature. In literature, this gets representation in two ways. First of all, either they try to legitimize the privileges of the upper class, or they try to represent the voices of the marginalized people who are suppressed by the upper class. So two types of representations are made in literature according to Marxist critics. the representation of the marginalized class relating to the poor peasants, poor workers, industrial workers, wage earners, colonized subjects. They are represented with the ideological conflict with the upper class people. Whatever ideology is represented by the upper class people, this ideology is not taken into consideration by the marginalized people. The ideologies of the upper class are not certainly accepted by the field workers, peasants, industrial workers, wage earners, colonized subjects. Now we'll take up who are the major voices in Marxist criticism. In other words, who are the major critics of Marxism theory or theory of Marxism. There is a critic called George Lukács. George Lukács always advocated for the depiction of realism in literature. He thought that literature can best represent the totality of social relation. How social relation is vitiated, how social relation is eroded, how social relation is destroyed, that is described or depicted in literature. Who believed? George Lukács. Lukács also criticized the experimentation made by the modern writers, and he considers it as subjective representation. And this representation of the modern writers has no relevance to the historical or social conditions of the society. So he believed that the modernist representation or the representation made by the modern writers of the society is partial, one-sided, incomplete, in which there is no mention of the historical background, there is no mention of the social condition. They are only making experimentation with different kinds of experiences. Lukács also considered writers like Balzac and Tolstoy as the great writers who captured the essence of their societies. He is full of praise for the great writers like Balzac, great writers like Leo Tolstoy, and Lukács believed that Balzac and Tolstoy were the great masters who captured and received the essence of their society, contemporary society. The society in which they were living, Tolstoy and Balzac were living, they have got churned out the essence of social condition, historical condition. Then there is another critic whose name is Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci introduced a new concept. He is a Marxist critic like George Lukács, like Friedrich Engels, like Karl Marx, and Gramsci said cultural hegemony prevails in which the ruling classes maintain the power not only by applying force, but they ensure the prevalence of their hegemony through cultural institutions that secure the consent of the people. So the cultural hegemony of the ruling class is carried forward through cultural institutions. Hegemony means leadership, monopoly, arbitrariness, imposing your own values. King can make no wrong. Whatever you say, others must follow it blindly. So this concept of hegemony was prevalent in the society according to Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci said, that cultural hegemony is perpetuated through the cultural institutions by the ruling class. He also talked about the class distinction. All the critics of Marxism, Louis Althusser, Antonio Gramsci, George Lukács, Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, all of them they talked about class struggle. And they believed that the two classes always exist. There is great distinction between the two classes. One is the privileged class, the other is the unprivileged class. And the privileged class used to snatch away all the facilities, all the scopes, all the advantages, and they also influence the ruling class. So Gramsci said, the cultural hegemony is perpetuated by the ruling class, and this hegemony is perpetuated through cultural institutions patronized by the marginalized people. So very strategically, very diplomatically, they perpetuate cultural hegemony through cultural institutions. And those cultural institutions are patronized by the marginalized people, the poorer section of people. So literature plays a role to shape the common sense and the collective values. Gramsci believes that literature plays a role to shape the common sense and the collective values in the society. Then comes another critic named Louis Althusser. Althusser believed that simple reflection theory is not acceptable. And he said that the literature is an ideological state apparatus. Through literature, the ruling class tries to convince people, persuade people to believe their ideologies. So according to Louis Althusser, literature is an ISA, ideological state apparatus. And through literature, by using it as an ideological state apparatus, it tries to enforce the ideologies, and it also shows the contradictions, the gaps, and thus the readers get a scope to study the dominant ideologies, and they get a chance to evaluate and criticize the ideologies of the ruling class. There is also ideological repressed ideological state apparatus, repressive state apparatus, RSA. Repressive state apparatus is used by the ruling class through repression, threat, intimidation. If you don't do this, police will come and take you to jail. If you don't do this, court will punish you. So these repressive state apparatuses are court, police, and other places of, giving decision, giving justice, imparting justice. So Louis Althusser talked about two apparatuses. One is ideological state apparatus and the other is repressive state apparatus. Althusser also said literature is used as ideological state apparatus. Religious places of worship are also considered to be ideological state apparatus. Clubhouse, library, temple, cultural organizations, they are called ideological state apparatus. And police station, courts are called repressive state apparatus. Then we come to the next critic. We will take up the next Marxist critic. His name is Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams pioneered a concept called cultural materialism. He talked about cultural materialism. Raymond Williams argued that literature is part of a structure of feeling. Literature is part of a structure of feeling which reflects the lived experience and cultural practices of the people in a particular historical context. So according to Raymond Williams, literature carries forward cultural materialism by reflecting on the lived experiences and the cultural practices of the people in a particular historical moment. Raymond Williams expanded the contours of Marxist criticism beyond the class struggle to the struggle in culture. And he also paved the way for cultural studies. Raymond Williams said, literature not only depicts the class struggle, it also depicts the differences in culture. The differences in values, the differences in cultural practices, and those things are portrayed in literature. As a result, Raymond Williams was viewed as the proponent of cultural studies because he talked about cultural differences. He said, the cultural practices of different kinds of people, maybe the privileged, maybe the unprivileged, maybe the poor, maybe the rich, all these people, whatever cultural practice they used to make, that is reflected in literature. In other words, according to Raymond Williams, literature is the medium to represent the cultural practices adopted and undertaken by different types of people at different times. So, it is believed that Raymond Williams laid the foundation stone of another literary theory known as cultural studies. Because Raymond Williams said that literature not only depicts the class struggle, it also deals with the cultural practices of people, the cultural differences of different types of groups, castes, creed, communities, religions, etc. Then we have another Marxist critic whose name is Terry Eagleton. Terry Eagleton was a great name in the domain of Marxist criticism, and he popularized, appreciated, patronized Marxist criticism in the late 20th century. He viewed literature as the reflection of ideology, that ideology which is shaped by the historical forces. He talked about cultural practices. Who? Raymond Williams, and Terry Eagleton talks about historical influences. Terry Eagleton said that literature represents an ideology. What kind of ideology is represented by literature? Literature represents that kind of ideology which is shaped by the historical forces. The works of Terry Eagleton make Marxist criticism accessible to the modern readers of literature. In other words, Terry Eagleton propounded Marxism in a big way, and he popularized Marxism among all types of people living in the modern age, the students, readers, critics, etc. Let's discuss how the concept of Marxism or the concept of class distinction, cultural practices are represented in the writers. Which writer represents Marxian ideology? We can talk about Charles Dickens, the British novelist who exposed the social injustice, the social disparity, the class distinction, the evil impact of industrialization, the laborer issues, the industrial workers issues in his novels. There is another writer, playwright called Bertolt Brecht, whose plays embody the Marxian ideology, Marxist ideology, and it aims to provoke critical awareness among the people about social injustice, social disparity. There is another writer called Ngugi Wa Thiong. Ngugi Wa Thiong employs literature as a weapon against colonialism and capitalist exploitation. So Thiong writes against colonialism. What is colonialism? The oppression made by the ruling class over the ruled class. The colonizers carry out oppression on the colonized people. So Gugi Wa Thiong used to write against colonialism. Even very important, very famous works of Shakespeare or Milton can be appreciated, can be evaluated through the lens of Marxism. And those writings reveal in detail how there is dynamics of class struggle, dynamics of ideological tension. So, in a nutshell, Marxism as a literary theory revolutionized the entire domain of literary criticism by shifting the attention of criticism from isolated texts to social, economic, and ideological forces that shape literature. So, in Marxist criticism, the social, economic, and ideological forces they call the shots. So, Marxist criticism believed that literature is not only a source of entertainment, literature is a source of reformation. Literature is a source of change. Literature is a source of social practice. It is a tool of ideology which represents the class struggle, and it is a catalyst for social change. It, the strength of literature lies in reminding the readers that art and literature are not neutral but embedded in history, embedded in hegemony, embedded in repressive state apparatus. So, Marxist criticism continues to inspire people over the years, and it also brings about the origin of the cultural studies, post-colonial theory, feminist criticism, with enduring relevance to understand literature as part of a struggle against injustice. And Marxist criticism or Marxist theory wants to bring about emancipation of human beings, wants to end the class struggle, wants to bring about change in society, and wants to tell people that the proletariats should be given that much of importance as the bourgeois are getting. Now let's discuss what is the view of Marxist critics on society and history. What is their view? What is the opinion of the Marxist critics on society and on history? The Marxist critics believe that history is nothing but emerges out of materialism. So they talk about historical materialism. They say that material conditions are responsible to shape the society. The society is shaped by the material conditions. So the material conditions should be determined and is determined by literature. The critics of Marxism, they feel that the economic base the productive source, the relation between the producer and the worker, they shape the society. Law, politics, culture, and ideology, they are the superstructure. Whatever law is framed, whatever cultural practices are carried out, whatever ideological concepts are offered, all those things are superstructure, and that superstructure is the literature. So base is the economic condition, the socio-cultural condition, the historical condition, and superstructure is the literature. Marx differed with Hegel. Hegel believed that history is driven by ideas. But Marx said that economic production and class relations are the driving forces in society. Ideas don't drive. Ideas are not the driving forces, as believed by Hegel. Marx believed that ideas don't propel. Economic production and class relation are the propelling factors. Marx also believed that if you glide through the history of human civilization, you will always feel that progress has come through different stages. How is the progress determined? The progress, according to Marx, is determined by the mode of production. If a country is making more production, we will feel that the country is progressive. If there is less production, if it is unable to fulfill the wants of the people, then we feel that the country is a backward country. There are three types of countries, three types of determinant factors. One is a developed country. Second is a developing country which is on the path of development. And the third is an undeveloped country which has not witnessed any development at all. That's why it is called undeveloped country. So Marx said that economic production determines the standard of development. If there is more production, we call the country as a developed state. If there is less production or no production, if the people are having so many wants, if the people are affected by poverty, then we feel that the country is an underdeveloped country or undeveloped country. So the progress of a country is determined by the mode of production. In the society, we come across different types of ideologies. One is primitive communism. What is primitive communism? There is no class distinction. There is only one community. All are equal. Then we have a slave society. Slave versus master. Class distinction started. There is one ruling class. There is one ruled class. There is one master. there is one slave, or there are masters and there are slaves. Then there is feudalism. There are feudal lords and there is serfdom, zamindar system. You are the landowner. You don't till your land. You give the land to your sharecroppers. Just by virtue of being the owner, you get the production, lion's share of the production. And the poor sharecropper who has tilled your land, produced grains, he gets only a very minimum portion of the produce. Very minimal portion of the produce goes to the sharecropper. The large portion or the lion's share is enjoyed by the owner. So this is called feudalism. The feudal lord used to take everything. Then comes capitalism. Again, bourgeois and proletariat. There is bourgeois system, the upper class people, and there is proletariat, the lower class people. There is a great distinction, great deal of difference between the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois people belong to the richer section. They live amid luxury. They live amid plenty. Whereas the proletariat lives amid wants, inadequacy. Then comes socialism. Socialism was a kind of reaction against capitalism. Socialism talks about classless society. And socialism says the capitalism should come to an end. The national wealth should be equitably distributed among all categories of people, all sections of people. There should not be any kind of poverty in society. So they championed the cause of poverty removal. They wanted that poverty should be removed and everyone should become self-sufficient. So at every stage, we come across the class struggle. The struggle, the conflict between two classes of people. The oppressor and the oppressed. The ruler and the ruled. The colonizer and the colonized. The bourgeois and the proletariat. The rich and the poor. The haves and the have-nots, the privileged and the unprivileged. So this class struggle always is found in the society. The Marxist critics, they believe that the history of human civilization is nothing but the history of class struggle. Human history reveals in a loud and clear manner that there is acute class distinction in society. The dominant classes take control of the economic resources and impose their ideologies through the superstructure of what? Of judiciary, police, school, college, everything. Literature, the oppressed class, they show resistance. And when the oppressed class show resistance, at that time there is a confrontation between two groups of people, the privileged and the unprivileged. And that leads to transformation in the society. Take, for example, the French Revolution. Take, for example, the Russian Revolution, which took place in 1917. Take, for example, Indian freedom movement of 1947. So these are the historical facts which subscribe that class struggle has always been there. And class struggle always leads to social transformation. And social transformation is possible only when the oppressed class resists the ideological, perpetuation of the ruling class. And the Marxist critics believed, as we have already discussed, that the economic system, the economic factor, the economic condition of a state is very important because it determines the forces of production, the relations of production, the factors of production, the procedure of production, the modality of production, the method of handling the workers, industrial units, etc. And then the superstructure. Superstructure controls politics, law, religion, art, culture, and philosophy. So superstructure has a very vast area, which is only possible when the base is strong. What is the base? The economic condition, the economic system. If the economic system is good, if the economic condition is good, the superstructure will be better. The base determines the superstructure. Unless there is a base with strength, with vivacity, the superstructure cannot be built. So the superstructure reinforces as well as legitimizes the base. Both are complementary to each other. The base builds the superstructure. The base determines the superstructure, and the superstructure legitimizes the base. Then the Marxist critics believed that change can also happen, and it will happen through dialectical contradictions. What is dialectical contradiction? It is a kind of conflict. Dialectical confrontation is a kind of conflict between the productive forces and the relations of production. For example, there is a factory, and in the factory there is one factory owner, the rich man, the rich industrialist, and the other, the factory workers. It is the labor of the factory workers which brings about the production. If the factory workers don't labor hard, the factory owner cannot get good production. So the factory workers are very important. Factory workers are indispensable to the production of the factory. Then feudalism. There is the growth of commerce and it led to capitalism also. Feudal relation, I told you, there are feudal lords and there is serfdom. Who are the serfs? The serfs are the people who are working under the feudal lords. The people who are working under the feudal lords, they are the poor people. They don't have any source of income other than to earn their livelihood by making manual labor under the feudal lord. So, the growth of commerce is possible only through the labor of the serfs, labor of the unprivileged people. And sometimes, when they don't resist and they tolerate everything, whatever suppression and oppression, injustice, maladministration is perpetrated on them, they become violent, they become rebellious. And after they become rebellious, the transformation takes place. Social transformation takes place. So capitalism grows when the rich becomes richer, poor becomes poorer, and there is no parity in income. There is disparity in income. Capitalism creates wealth, but this wealth goes to whom? It goes to the privileged people. The unprivileged people don't get any share in capitalism or the dividends of capitalism. All the dividends of capitalism are taken away by the privileged people. Capitalism expands production, no doubt, but this expansion of production or good production is possible only through the exploitation of labor. The poor workers, they are made to work very hard for 10 hours, 12 hours a day. They make night duty. They are not given lunch break. They are given very low wages. So they pay low wages, extract more work, increase production. And the dividend or the profit obtained out of good production is taken by the industrial owner, factory owner. So what do the workers get? They get nothing. They are simply exploited. So such type of contradictions used to exist according to Marxist critics, and they feel is such type of contradiction, when it comes to a head, when it comes to the maximum level, at that time transformation takes place through revolution and capitalism is turned into socialism. The Marxist critics believe that socialism means classless society. All people are equal. Economic standard is equal. Socialism is only possible with the end of capitalism. How can the capitalism end? The capitalism can end with the revolution of the exploited workers, the unprivileged workers, the proletariat revolution. So this is how, from the perspective of Marxism, we can study how society is shaped not by abstract ideas, but by class struggle, material conditions. It is the economic forces who drive historical change, and they move humanity through successive modes of production until the class distinction is abolished. So this is how the Marxists viewed society. Now we will study how, according to Marxist critics, superstructure is very much the key factor to understand or to have a deeper understanding of literature, art, philosophy, social institutions, and how the social institutions are represented through the superstructure. Superstructure is obviously literature. Superstructure helps others understand what? Understand literature, understand art, understand philosophy, and understand various socio-cultural institutions. So in this connection, as we have already discussed, they also made a reference to base. They said the economic condition is the base. If you want to have the proliferation of superstructure, the flourish of superstructure, the strength of superstructure, the vivacity of superstructure, you have to rely on the base. And how do you rely on the base? Because the base is the economic condition. Economic condition is very important. If there is strength of economy, superstructure will be vibrant. Base refers to the mode of production, the forces of production, the relation of production, the relation between the factory owner and the factory worker, and superstructure refers to the cultural, political, legal, religious, and ideological institutions built upon that base. So on the base of the economic condition, certain institutions like cultural, political, legal, religious, and ideological institutions are built. Law, legal authorities, state authorities, religion, church, temple, etc., morality, literature, philosophy, art, they all constitute superstructure. So what is superstructure and what is base? Base is the economic background, economic backbone, economic condition, and what is the superstructure? Superstructure is law, state, religion, morality, literature, philosophy, art, culture, etc. They justify and stabilize Sometimes they contest the economic base as well. What do? They stabilize, they justify, they fortify, they legitimize, and sometimes the economic base also comes to contest against the superstructure. So Marx said, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but it is their social being that determines their consciousness. This is very important. Karl Marx said, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being. Consciousness doesn't determine your being, but it is your being or social being that determines your consciousness. So the Marxist critics believed that the superstructure represents society in a symbolic manner, in an ideological manner. The superstructure represented society in a ideological manner, in a symbolic manner. Literature, art reflect the class struggle, the class distinction, the class structure, the values, the contradictions of a given historical moment. For example, epic poetry of feudal times glorifies the kings and warriors. So, the epics celebrating the glories of the warriors and kings, they talk about the feudal base and feudal superstructure. The Victorian novels reveal the moral and social tension of industrial capitalism. So what do they show? The Victorian novels, they reflect the capitalist base and bourgeois superstructure. So literature definitely brings about or presents the criticism of the socio-cultural institutions. The superstructure, according to Marxist critics, serves largely to the ruling class interest. It is not monolithic. So literature, philosophy, critical thought can also challenge the dominant ideology by exposing the exploitation, hypocrisy, and contradictions. For example, the novel Hard Times, written by Charles Dickens, criticized the industrial capitalism and the dehumanization during the industrial capitalism. Charles Dickens raised his voice against capitalism. He was a critic of industrial revolution. He thought the industrial revolution caused large-scale unemployment. Whatever work was done by 5 persons, that was done by one switch, one machine. You switch on, the machine starts and it delivers the goods, performs the work done by 5 persons. Bertolt Brecht's theater attempted to awaken class consciousness by showing contradictions in bourgeois society. So Brecht was also a social reformer and he wanted to create a kind of class consciousness among the people. He wanted to make the people conscious how you are exploited, how the upper class people are exploiting, how the upper class people, they are safeguarding their interest and damaging your interest. So according to the Marxist critics, the superstructure is not just a passive reflection of the class struggle in society. It has autonomy as well. Althusser also felt that the superstructure has relative autonomy. Superstructure has relative autonomy. It has the ability to reinterpret and subvert the economic base. Superstructure is very powerful. It has the strength, it has the ability to reinterpret the ideologies, to reform the society, to remove class distinction in society, and to establish a socialist pattern of society. He has referred to, the Marxist critics have referred to the Romantic poetry. In the Romantic poetry of William Wordsworth, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and William Blake, we find that how they have resisted the alienation of industrial capitalism, and they envisioned modification, alteration, change. The industrial capitalism should be converted to socialism. In an atmosphere of socialism, all categories of people, all classes of people will have uniform economic standard. They will not suffer from the want of food, want of cloth, want of shelter, want of anything. So, the Marxist critics definitely brought about a new awareness in the society, and they also could not appreciate the values foisted by the traditional criticism, the guidelines laid down by the traditional criticism, which said literature is timeless, literature is universal. Who said? Traditional critics. But Marxist critics said literature within its superstructural function.
And you have been raising this
represents
several times. So I would like you to press on these issues now, discuss with everybody, so everyone follows the right instruction.
It 4 5 changes. So please write little bit description about whatever you have done, like created generic tables, whatever you have used that table, where you can place that table, which scope, like a full generic, then play that point in this full generic, so anyone can able to use that component. If it's only for owner scope level, not for globally, that table not used for properties also, only for owner scope. So please mention that also, like this was a full generic global
So superstructure has the ability to expose the evils of society. Whatever evils are prevalent in society, superstructure gets the ability to remove those evils and bring about a kind of transformation in society. Marxist criticism situates literature within its superstructural function because literature for the Marxist critics is a great instrument to bring about reformation in society. And through this superstructure of literature, capitalism can be brought to an end and socialism may prevail. The exploitation of the poor people can stop. Thus, criticism itself becomes a tool of ideological struggle. So, criticism, especially the Marxist criticism, believes that it is an ideological platform to bring about changes in the society. And the monopoly of the upper class, the monopoly of the ruling class can be brought to an end. The superstructure, according to Marxist critics, represents society by embodying the dominant class's worldview and values, while also providing a space for criticism and resistance. Marxist critics believed that the superstructure embodied the values, ideologies of the ruling class, but at the same time, it also offers a platform to the common people, poor people, exploited people to show resistance and to make criticism. Literature, art, and philosophy, they are never neutral. They either reproduce or challenge the power relations of their time. What happened in George Orwell's Animal Farm? What happened in Hard Times of Charles Dickens? So there you find
Like,
a superstructure has the ability to transform the society, to bring about change in the society, and
Now for
to make people conscious
delete
of
right now as we speak.
please don't touch any other person. They have some parts of like use for other changes.
Let's do one thing. Karthik, bhai. So if you can, we'll start with you.
ପ୍ରଭୁ ଇଏ କଣ ଗୋଟେ ଦିନ ଦଉଛନ୍ତି ଇଏ ଏଥର ତ ହଉନି ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ମୁଁ ତାକୁ ରିମୁଭ୍ କରିପାରୁନି କି ଇଏ କରିପାରୁନି ଇଏ ଗୋଟେ ପିଲା ଟେକ୍ ବଡି ସେ ସେ ଗୋଟେ ଇୟର ଟେକ୍ ବଡି ଅଛି ସେ ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ଡିଷ୍ଟର୍ବାନ୍ସ ଆରମ୍ଭ କଲାଣି ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ଆରମ୍ଭ କଲା ନାଇଁ ଏଇ ପାଟି କରୁଛି ହଁ ରିମୁଭ୍ କରିଦିଅନ୍ତୁ ପୁରା ତାକୁ ରିମୁଭ୍ ଟୋଟାଲି ବ୍ୟାନ୍ କରିଦଉନାହାନ୍ତି ପ୍ଲସ୍ ମତେ ଆପଣ ଇଏ କଲେ କୋଷ୍ଟ କରିକି ସେ ପାୱାରଟା ମୁଁ କିଛି ବୁଝିପାରୁନି ଆପଣ ଜାଣିଥିବେ ନା ମୁଁ କଣ ଜାଣିଛି ସେଟା ଗୋଟେ ଥର କରିଦେଲେ ତ ହେଇଯିବା କଥା ସେଭ୍ କରିନାହାନ୍ତି କି ତାକୁ ହଁ ହଁ ଡିଷ୍ଟର୍ବାନ୍ସ ବୋଲି ଲେଖିକି ଛାଡ଼ି ଦିଅନ୍ତୁ ପ୍ଲସ୍ ମତେ ଦିଅନ୍ତୁ ପାୱାର ମୁଁ ତାକୁ ରିମୁଭ୍ କରିବି ଆଉ ବ୍ୟାନ୍ କରିଦେବି ଯୋଉ ବ୍ଲକ୍ କରିଦେବି ହେଲା କି ସେ ପାୱାରଟା ଦେଇକି ତାକୁ ସେଭ୍ କରନ୍ତୁ ବା କାହାକୁ ଟିକେ କମ୍ପ୍ୟୁଟର ଏକ୍ସପର୍ଟକୁ ପଚାରନ୍ତୁ ଏଇଟା କେମିତି କରିହବ ବୋଲି ହେଲା ପଚାରିକି କରିଦେବେ ଏଇଟା ପ୍ରତିଦିନ କିଏ କରିବ କହିଲେ କାଲି ଥିଲା ଆଜି ହଉନି ଆଚ୍ଛା ମୁଁ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ରିକ୍ୱେଷ୍ଟ କରିଥିଲି ୟାଙ୍କୁ ଆମର ଦିବ୍ୟଦେବଙ୍କୁ ମୋର ଯୋଉ 26 ତାରିଖ ଆଉ 25 ତାରିଖ ନାହିଁ କି 4 ରୁ 6 ତାକୁ ଟିକେ ରିସିଡ୍ୟୁଲ କରିବା ମୁଁ ଟିକେ 25-26 ଦିନ କାମ ଅଛି ରିସିଡ୍ୟୁଲ କରିବାକୁ ଧରନ୍ତୁ 29 ତାରିଖ ବା 1 ତାରିଖ କି ସେ ତ ମ୍ୟାଡାମ ନଉଛନ୍ତି 6 ରୁ 8 ତାଙ୍କୁ ଟିକେ କହିକି କରେଇଦେବେ ଅରୁଣ ସାର୍ଙ୍କ ନମ୍ବର ମୋ ପାଖରେ ନାହିଁ ଯଦି ପାରିବେ ମତେ ଯଦି ପଠେଇ ଦିଅନ୍ତେ WhatsApp रे पठाई दियंतु ठीक अछि थैंक यू So this is how superstructure plays a very dominant role along with the base. So what do you learn so far? So far we have discussed Marxist criticism is very important, a literary theory, a critical theory which presupposes the predominant role of base and superstructure. The Marxist critics like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Terry Eagleton, Raymond Williams, Louis Althusser, Antonio Gramsci, George Lukács, they refer to two things. One is the base, the other is the superstructure. If base is strong, superstructure will be very strong and productive. According to them, base is the economic foundation, the economic background, and superstructure is literature, art, philosophy, history, all other things. So there is a cordial and close relationship, complementary relationship between base and superstructure. If base is weak, superstructure will be weak. If base is strong, superstructure will be strong. And superstructure represents obviously the ideologies of the ruling class, but at the same time, it also has the ability to raise the voice of protest. It can show resistance. It can make criticism of the ideologies of the ruling class. And when they raise their voice of protest, when they start critiquing the ideologies of the ruling class, transformation is possible. Transformation is inevitable. So, in literature, especially in Marxist criticism, we notice the literature has a commitment. What kind of commitment? Social commitment, cultural commitment, economic commitment, and cultural commitment. Literature engages with social issues, moral issues, ethical issues, cultural issues, political issues, and literature is written with a view to bringing about some viable, tangible impact on the readers. Of course, a writer never tells anything directly. Whatever he has to speak, he will tell indirectly. But that becomes very impactful. And the writer has a sense of responsibility towards the society, towards history, towards morality, towards a particular cause, towards a particular issue. The writer has tremendous commitment, exemplary commitment, unique dedication, and the writer is committed to influencing thought, bringing about change in the society. Jean-Paul Sartre, the great philosopher, he said, "The committed literature is that literature where writers take responsibility for their words and intervene in society. Jean-Paul Sartre said that writers take up responsibility for their words, for their opinion, for their ideas, and they intervene in society. So the role of writer is very significant. The role of writer is very important according to Jean-Paul Sartre. As far as literature is concerned, literature exercises, embodies autonomy. Literature is autonomous. Literature is never independent, is never subordinate to anything. It is autonomous, it is autotelic, and it is independent. It is self-sufficient as well. Literature exists for its own sake. It doesn't exist for others. It exists for itself. It has autonomy. It has independence. It has certain external duties. Its impact is very genuine. Literature offers aesthetic charm. It contains a formal structure, and it also deals with imaginative landscapes. Literature is a blending between realism and fantasy. Art doesn't need to serve society, but it has its own intrinsic worth. It has its own inner worth. It doesn't need to serve society. Art for art's sake movement was launched by critics like Walter Pater. They said art is self-sufficient. Art need not teach morality. Art should be worshipped for its own sake, for its beauty, for its aesthetic charm. So, philosophers like Plato, literary critics like Plato, they viewed literature as socially dangerous. As I was telling you, in the theory of mimesis, Plato said art is twice removed from reality. And he considered literature to be dangerous. He said poets are misguiding the readers and they need to be controlled. He thought that they do not have any commitment. Plato said that the writers do not have any commitment to society. On the other hand, his disciple Aristotle valued, respected the autonomy of mimesis. And he said, art has its own form of knowledge. Art need not be dependent on others. Art is autonomous. Art is autotelic. Art is aesthetic. Art has the aesthetic beauty. Romantic critics, they stressed the autonomy of literature and they gave primacy to imagination, to emotion, and they gave also primacy to subjectivity. They also showed commitment in their literature because it was Wordsworth, who used the language of the common man in his poetry. He said that poetry should be accessible to the common man. A poet should choose incidents and situations from ordinary and common life and throw a color of imagination in such a manner so as to make the ordinary things extraordinary and common things uncommon. That was the definition of poetic diction by Wordsworth, mentioned in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was written in 1800. So the Romantic critics, they gave primacy to emotion and imagination, to subjectivity, and simultaneously they also talked about commitment in literature. While talking about commitment in literature, they said that the language of common man should be used. The Marxist critics viewed literature. Critics like George Lukács, Bertolt Brecht, they viewed literature as a reflection of social reality. It is. They have done the right thing. Brecht and Lukács, they said that literature is the reflection of social reality. It is the reflection of social reality. There is no doubt about it. There are post-colonial writers like Ngugi Wa Thiong and Arundhati Roy who focused on the duty of literature, commitment of literature to history and to the cause of the oppressed people. Thiong and Arundhati Roy, they argued that literature is the platform to ventilate the grievances of the marginalized people, the oppressed people, the suppressed people, the people who do not get square meals a day, the people who pass through financial stress, the people who are having different kind of difficulties, who are not having independence to ventilate their grievances. So, the new critics like T.S. Eliot, Cleanth Brooks, John Crowe Ransom, they emphasized that the poem itself is always detached from history and politics. Formalism and aestheticism prioritize structure, ambiguity, irony, and universal beauty. So they contended that a poem should be detached from history and it should concentrate on the structure, close reading of the text. And while making the close reading of the text, what do you evaluate? What do we analyze? We analyze the form, we analyze the structure, we try to find out irony, satire, ambiguity, paradox, allegory, etc. Along with that, we also try to discover beauty. People like Jean-Paul Sartre said that literature is full of action and words are like weapons. Writers should be committed to truth and freedom. Sartre said that writers should be committed to truth and freedom. There is another critic called Fyodor Adorno. He said, literature is autonomous, art is autonomous, but behind its autonomy, it resists oppression. It refuses to be reduced to propaganda. True art believes in its autonomy, preserves its autonomy, but it can never remain socially neutral. It has to support one or the other. So as a result, Adorno said, art is autonomous, no doubt, but it is not reduced to propaganda, but it oppresses, it opposes injustice, it supports fair judgment. Critics like T.S. Eliot advocated the theory of impersonality in art. He said, a poet should never be subjective. A poet should always be objective. And remember his definition of poetry. What is Eliot's definition of poetry? Poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. This is what Eliot had defined poetry. And he said, whatever issue, whatever topic, whatever theme the poet is dealing with, the theme should have universal relevance. It's not that the theme appeals to him, he will write on that theme. So poetry, instead of becoming subjective, it should be objective. Then he talked about the role of tradition. He said, tradition plays a paramount role in shaping the individual talent. If you are having talent, the talent can be made more sharp. The talent can further flourish if you make an attempt to study the great works of your predecessors. If you look at the world literature, there also you find it is autonomous, but it has influence. How does it show influence? Say, for example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by H.B. Stowe, which champions the cause of abolition. There is another novel by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. There, the writer has talked about colonial encounter. And cultural loss. How the colonized people are oppressed and they have lost their own culture. In the poetry of Pablo Neruda, the political solidarity is described. So, if you look at the world poetry, there you find also there is commitment. What kind of commitment? They want to bring about some change in the society. Their literature is not only meant to bring about entertainment, it is also aimed at giving some enlightenment, creating some awareness to bring about reformation in society. There is autonomy in literature, there is no doubt about it. And in the literature of Oscar Wilde. In the literature of Mallarmé, poetry, symbolist poetry of Mallarmé, French poet, he has talked about pure aesthetic beauty. In the poems of John Donne and poems of John Keats, the focus is laid on the aspects of beauty, irony, and paradox. Literature exists as a weapon of commitment, as a platform for autonomy. So we come across two traits in literature. One is autonomy and the other is commitment. If there is no commitment, people will throw it as hot potato. Nobody would feel like reading literature. So it goes without saying that literature is full of commitment, literature is full of autonomy, and autonomous works also deal with cultural matters. Committed works also show aesthetic dimension. So although there is autonomy and there is commitment, still then literature has two aspects. One aspect is to teach you, give you some message, give you some moral, and the other is to deal with aesthetic dimension, the dimension of beauty, the dimension of art. So commitment in literature brings about its relevance. Literature appears to be relevant if it is showing some commitment to socio-cultural, political, economic cause. Remember French Revolution. How French Revolution was brought about by the writings of three great, philosophers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. These three philosophers, they brought about a kind of awareness among the French, and they rose in revolt against the oppression of Louis XVI. It occurred in 1789, and it was a grand success. And do you know, the French Revolution had its great influence on the writings of Romantic poets. The Romantic poets, they were very much impacted and influenced by the three philosophers and the French Revolution. The three philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. So commitment in literature adds a greater dimension of relevance to literature. Autonomy in literature gives it a sense of universality and aesthetic power. So literature is considered as a means of change, as a means of transformation, as a means of reformation, and autonomy in literature makes it a work of art. So both autonomy and commitment, they make literature sustainable with its relevance across the times. All the time, the relevance of literature is felt in every corner of the world. No one can say that literature is useless, literature is meaningless. No, it can never be meaningless. Now let's discuss the concept of ideology. Ideology is connected to literature. Literature sometimes deals with the ideology of the ruling class. So literature and ideology are deeply connected with one another. Literature not only reflects, it also shapes and opposes, criticizes the predominant ideas, the predominant values, the predominant power structures in the society. So ideology is nothing but a system of beliefs, a set of values, a set of ideas that attempt to justify and maintain the social, political, and economic arrangements. Karl Marx believed that ideology is a false consciousness. Karl Marx did not like ideology because ideology refers to the personal views, the personal ideas, the personal dogmas, the personal beliefs of certain group of people believing in the same set of values. And that group tries to implement and impose their ideologies on others. This is unfair. So Marx opposed ideology and he said ideology is a false consciousness. Ideology contains the ideas imposed by the ruling class to legitimize their dominance. Later thinkers, philosophers, critics like Louis Althusser, he considered ideology as something that works in an invisible manner through cultural practices. So Althusser believed that ideology acts in an invisible manner and it is manifested through cultural practices. Sometimes literature is also considered as a product of ideology. When literature is created within a specific social and historical context, it is considered to foster the ideology of a particular group. Writers are sometimes influenced by their time's dominant ideology, maybe religious ideology, maybe political ideology, maybe cultural ideology, maybe economic ideology. For example, medieval literature reflects ideology of Christianity. Renaissance literature reflected ideology of humanism and emerging individualism. Victorian novels, they reflected the ideology of class and gender. Although literature reflects ideology, there is also literature which challenges the dominant ideologies. We must remember, literature not only reflects ideology, not only embodies ideologies, literature also challenges the dominant ideologies and expose the contradictions within the ideology. For example, George Orwell's novel 1984, which critiques the totalitarian ideology. Charles Dickens' novels like Hard Times, they expose industrial capitalism, the evils of industrial capitalism. Post-colonial writers like Ngugi Wa Thiong and Salman Rushdie, they question the colonial and imperial ideologies. The critical theories also impact literature and ideology. What is their view? What are the views of the critical theorists? The critical theory of Marxism believes that literature is a part of the superstructure that reinforces the economic base, and sometimes it also resists it. Althusser says, Louis Althusser, literature reveals how ideology works by making its operations visible. Antonio Gramsci believes that literature is a platform for cultural hegemony, and that reinforces ruling class ideologies. And it also sometimes challenges it. The theory of feminism says that literature reproduces and critiques patriarchal ideology. Post-colonialism critical theory says that literature exposes and resists colonial ideologies of race, gender, identity, and power. So ideology is practiced in literature also. In other words, the practice of ideology is noticed in literature. For example, if you go back to the age of Renaissance, when Shakespeare wrote 37 plays, in those plays you find, especially the tragedies, we find the ideology of monarchy, because Shakespearean plays, they deal with monarchy, order, divine right, and also they question the authority of the monarchs. The bright example is King Lear and also Hamlet. In romantic poetry, we also notice that enlightenment is challenged. The enlightenment dealt with by neoclassical poets was challenged. Industrial capitalism was challenged, and they propounded their love. They vouched their love for nature, imagination, and emotion. In modern age, the ideology faced different kind of problems, and that ideology was mutual conflict, horrors of war, First World War, which questioned meaning, order, and authority. Dalit literature. Dalit literature deals with a kind of ideology that challenges the hierarchy of caste, creed, religion, community, etc. So, literature, viewed broadly, can never be described as ideologically neutral. It is both shaped by ideologies and it also sometimes challenges ideologies. It sometimes resists ideologies, sometimes glorifies certain ideologies. So we can't say that literature is neutral. Literature appears to be neutral, but actually it is not neutral. It aligns with a particular ideology, and after reflecting that particular ideology, sometimes it goes out of the way to challenge certain ideologies also, which are found to be very detrimental to the larger interest of society. So we find that literature is never ideologically neutral. Rather, literature celebrates the ideological content of a particular group, and at times it also opposes the ideological content of another group when it finds that it is detrimental to the common interest of people in the society. Literature is always shaped by ideologies. Sometimes literature reinforces, fortifies ideologies. Sometimes literature opposes ideologies, resists ideologies, and sometimes it is found doing both the works by glorifying ideology and by opposing ideology. So glorification vis-a-vis opposition of ideology is also noticed in literature. So this is how we have discussed what is the impact of Marxist criticism on literature and what is the impact of Marxism on society, Marxist view of society, Marxism and literature also we have studied. We have studied commitment and autonomy in literature. We have also studied ideology vis-a-vis literature. So this is the end of it. Thank you very much. We'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.